The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
Good morning. So this morning we have the joy of welcoming back Reverend Keiryu Shut. Thank you for being here. And for those who, Lien has visited Stone Creek a number of times, but for those who have not met her before, she's the founding teacher of Access to Zen, which is centered around Oakland, mostly now in the ether. And we all trained together at San Francisco Zen Center. She received Dharma transmission from Zen Kate Blanche Hartman. And Lien is also, we're working collaboratively with her and Dalila Bothwell on a training program now that's part of a bigger project that is centered at Stone Creek on a grant from the Himera Foundation, looking at race and Dharma and how to alleviate the harm of racism within Sanghas in the United States. So thank you so much, Reverend Lien, for joining us again.
Thank you, Sarah and Charlie, and Sarah for the intro, and thank you to you two as the guiding teachers, and then of course Jisha Warner as the founding teacher for the invitation today. Glad to be back with you all. Again, my name's Keiryu Lien Shut. Let's start out by, of course, let's take a minute to absorb the very profound news of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg death. So I wonder if we could, actually in response to it, I have this quote from Suzuki Roshi when he talks about way-seeking mind. It's from March 26, 1966. When we feel the evanescence of life, or when we have problems for ourselves and direct feelings of the problem, of the fact you have to face, is how we arise way-seeking mind. So let's take a minute to just really feel that. And I think it's a huge moment in the history of our nation. Thank you. So just as a way to connect with everyone this morning, let's take a minute. And if you're not on video, and if you can be, go ahead and come on, and then check out who's in the room with you. And then I want to invite everyone to go off mute and say hi to the person on your left and your right, and at the same time, we'll all just do it. I know it's going to be like cacophony, and I'm okay with that. You're not, just make us all. I don't know what happens. So
hi, Robin.
All right. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, Lori.
Hi, Sarah. You're under.
Mary. Robin.
Hi, Ticho.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Vicky.
Lien.
Hi, Ellie.
Hi.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi there.
Hi, Sarah.
That's a friendly cacophony.
Yes, yes, yes. All right. As Sarah mentioned, Charlie, her and I, and a teacher named Dalila Bothwell from the Insight tradition. At my invitation, we're all four of us co-leading I like to call it an intensive because it's 4 months. So like a rain retreat, since we're focusing on a topic with our heart and mind and really investigating really on how to acknowledge and explore how to be compassionate and skillful with our location as racially identified people in the United States, their practice with it. Sorry, I'm gonna go to gallery view because I like to see people. I don't know if that affects your taping, sorry. Okay. So in particular, we're exploring what I'm calling, and it is in the popular speech this day in the United States, is what is our location in this? And as a way to understand that, location, I place it a lot around, I don't know if you guys have heard of what's called the matrix of domination or matrix of oppression by Patricia Hill Collins. And in that, it says that actually oppressions are really have intersectionality, and we can change our location depending on the dynamics, right? For instance, in race, as a person of color, my position is a down power position, but in the ability realm, or in the realm of oppression around physical and mental ability, I would be in the up position, right? So same thing with gender, class, sexual orientation, immigrant status. I can go on and on, right? So it's helpful then to see that in context is what's important, and how they operate. So in terms of, and I'm going to be talking today specifically about race because of this grant that we got. And in particular, it is to explore race and the structure of racism and our location in it through the lens of the Four Noble Truths. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. I will say in the system of American or United States racism, pretty much the discussion is about black and white, very much a dualistic dichotomy. And there's, validation for that given the intensity of slavery in the United States, or the history. Right? And it's a difficult one to be in for an Asian American because, again, because of that dichotomy, and also because in the system of white supremacy, Asian Americans, or the experience of Asians and Asian in America, have really been framed with the model minority myth, so that in service of anti-Blackness, we are often made a comparison that, we're almost white. We don't experience racism. And also we're always being pitted against Black people. Like, look at the Asian, they've done it, why can't you? So, and ignoring this complexity that I'm talking about, which is also not only racial, but class. And one way that we can think of that is, let's say, okay, so let's talk about the Four Noble Truths here, right? The Four Noble Truths, as most of us know, is classically, right, simplified framing, is there's dukkha, or usually translated as suffering, right? In life there is suffering. There's a reason or cause and conditions for how that happens. There's a way to end it. And then practice is the end of that. I will say that for most of us, we frame the fourth as the Eightfold Path, but Gil Fronsdal, who's a historian study of Buddhism, says that actually in the older writings, it's just practice and later it became the Eightfold Path. And today I'm going to focus a little bit more on just the that is practice, not the whole Eightfold, mostly due to time, to be perfectly honest. Right? So in this framing, we could say that, so in the first, and now I'm a little off my script here, so I'm gonna try to put this in context. So I have reframed and been supported by the Hamera Foundation to reframe these Four Noble Truths in a way that I call much more engage Four Noble Truths. How is it more than just remembering them, and how do they really apply to our lives, in particular into systems of oppression, so that there's a sense of restoration. How does our practice support us to be much more intentional in the restorative aspect of practice? And so the first then is, what is the harm, hurt, or dukkha here? Very much due to racial conditioning and structural racism. Second, what are the causes and conditions which brought this into being? And in particular, the focus is on conditions, because it's much more about then how is it more than just me, right? My experience. So a way that to think of that is my location, say, and I like to use Indra's net. So remember in Indra's net, we're all like jewels in the net, and we reflect each other. And that's usually how it's talked about, right? Like what I reflect you, you reflect me. There's an interconnected, much more, but I'm keeping it simple. But in general, it's talked about as just the jewel, just the location. And so in this framing, let's say we would focus it much more on the net itself. What are the strands that feed that? Where is it that the net perhaps has a lot more strands to support that one jewel or a section of the net? Recently, my girlfriend and I were up at, we're on our way to Ukiah, and she has some family, actually to go camping, but she has some family up there too. And you guys know between here and there, is it on 101? Eureka. On 101, you remember Willits, right? Willits used to drive through Willits, right? But then they decide, and I, you know, Deb knows this a lot more because she did a lot of stories on it as a journalist, but they decide a highway needed to go by. And so they cut down old growth. There was a lot of protests around it, why that was not really the policy that would be useful to support this jewel called Willits, you could say, right? And so now the strands, because of policies, have been shifted. And so this whole area that was so thriving is now really depressed, right? And so this is a way to understand how policies, and so you could also say the net are policies that support different aspects of the net, as opposed to just, you know, what can I do to, you know, strengthen my section of the net or your section of the net as individuals, right? So conditions is much more an emphasis on seeing what are the causes and conditions that are much more systemic, right? And not just individual. So then third would be restoration or non-harming as possible through knowing we have responsibility or accountability. And so a lot of that has to do with agency, right? Where do I and where do we as communities, where do we as policymakers, whatever position of policy you have, and many of us do, right? And actually knowing those and also realizing the importance of those and the responsibility that comes with those. Right, and how is it that we can use it in service of non-harming would be the fourth, right? How can we restore, rectify, can we focus on much more non-harming? And how does practice in particular, since it's the Four Noble Truths? So really exploring what is my location? And as an Asian American, that's really difficult in some ways, because again, this there's so much of the discourse, which includes the, you know, accessible reading, discussion these days, all the stuff on the internet around it is very black and white. And that, again, is part of the conditions. The main strands in US racial stuff is black and white. And so even though there's been lots of history, right, of violence towards Asian and Asian Americans in the United States. For instance, the largest mass lynching in American history was actually a massacre in 1871 by white and Hispanics on Chinese, right? And then in the US, the history of barring immigrants to the country began actually in 1882, specifically towards Chinese again, in the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And this is because after about 15 to 20,000 Chinese were recruited to build a transcontinental railroad. Of course, a lot of economics is involved in racism, right? And what that might not sound that much right now, but 15 to 20,000 was up to 90% of the workforce to build a railroad. And hundreds of Chinese workers died. There are no actually recording, see, that's also part of the invisibility of the Asian American experience. And then the only, I call it concentration camp on US soil during World War II as a response to World War II. I'm not talking about what I would also call concentration camps of indigenous people, of course, but we're talking about indirect to World War II was, of course, the concentration or internment camps of Japanese citizens and Japanese nationals, right, in the United States and in South America too. And of course, the current anti-Asian rhetoric and violence because of around COVID, right? So while it's complex, I feel like it is my study, you know, as a responsible citizen of this country. And of course, I've been studying for a long time. And so I want to really explore to you, and it's in the convert community, Buddhist community, you know, I'm often the only person of color or person of color teacher to much more non-people of color Sangha as I'm speaking or interacting. And so the sense of what is my location that's not necessarily in reaction to that is a key practice for me. And in this series that we're doing, this intensive, I'm really allowing myself to really explore that. And so I want to talk more about that with you today. I'm actually also from Hamera as a response to COVID. Earlier, of course, being an Asian American teacher, I have heard from a lot of Asian American practitioners about the impact of the anti-Asian racism around COVID earlier in the COVID, right? So I had then applied for a grant as we're exploring to work with Asian Americans around the racism. And so I'm running a whole similar course with just Asian Americans. And one of the books that we're using is called Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning by Kathy Park Hong. And in it, she talks about, in a chapter called The End of White Innocence, right? On page 87. And here's how history tends to repeat. 2016 was the year when whiteness became visible due to several factors. Of course, she's talking about then, of course, whiteness was a factor, say, you know, back in anti-slavery days and the emancipation, of course. So 2016 was the year when whiteness became visible due to several factors. The looming demographic shift in which white Americans will soon be a minority, the shrinkage of fixed employment that has caused some whites to feel disempowered and lash out at immigrants, and the media attention to Black and brown activists who since Ferguson have protested racial inequalities in sectors ranging from the judicial system to education to culture. White Americans, if they hadn't before, now felt marked for their skin color, and their reaction to being exposed as such was to feel shame. Shame is an inward, intolerable feeling, but it can lead to productive outcomes because of the self-scrutiny shame requires. We call that healthy shame, which we talk about in Buddhism, which I'm not going to now due to time. This has been the case for white progressives who have been evaluating how privilege governs their lives. Years ago, whenever a conversation about race came up, my white students were awkwardly silent. Park Hung is a educator in college. I can't remember what college right now, in poetry, in writing. Years ago, whenever a conversation about race came up, my white students were awkwardly silent. But now many of them are eager to listen and process the complexities of race relations and their roles in it, which gives me hope. Alkoff, who is actually Linda Martine Alkoff, a philosopher and theorist on feminist theology, race identity. So she teaches at CUNY. Alkoff calls this self-examination white double consciousness, which involves seeing, quote, themselves through both the dominant and non-dominant lens and recognizing the latter as a critical corrective truth. So of course, Linda Alkoff got this white double consciousness, and the frame double consciousness comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, right, in his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folks, published in 1903. And in the beginning chapter called Of Our Spiritual Striving, he defines, he's the one who came up with the term and defines it. And he writes, the Negro, remember this is in 1903, the Negro is a sort of seventh son. He had named all the races that he defined at that time. And so Negro being the seventh, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields to him no true self-consciousness, yet only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. This peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So the definition, because I have double consciousness, is this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. So Alkoff is saying, you know, so as a power up position, the privilege of the power up position is that you don't have to question your point of view, because it's in the power structure, it's the point of view that everything is supposed to relate to, right? And so she's saying that what happens if when we're in that power up position, we also then strive to look at the power down position. Now, again, this to me, right, and is about this dichotomy again, right, up and down, and black and white, right? And so to me, I wonder, what is the corrective truth then? If she's saying that the corrective truth for white progressives is to have a white double consciousness, what is the corrective truth for Asian Americans or for myself? And so I've come up with this theory. And I'm calling it the stages of corrective truth for Asian Americans. And the first is seeing internalized, assimilated truths. Right? Truth that we were taught and truth that we don't question, but really are conditioned, right? And often they're based on, from our families and our culture, based on survival, right? Because I know as an immigrant from Vietnam that obviously with the war, there's a lot of survival based stuff that gets carried over. And so that trauma of surviving is brought here. And so how to stay under the radar, how not to be, to take up space and draw attention to yourself is part of that survival trauma. And also how to not talk about things, right? So that's one, seeing internalized or assimilated truths. I'm going to go into them a little bit more as we go. Let me just lay them out. Then the second is seeing out reactive truths. For me, these are often due to what we think first as a way to respond after recognizing the impact of structural racism or racial conditioning. And then the third is clarifying, or as it is, truth. Responding, taking into account what we know as structural racism, reactive patterns in that, and then responding with informed agency, right? Or clarifying agency, or transformational agency. I haven't decided. I have 3 versions of that. So, and I want to do that through sharing a race awareness story. That's part of our class series too. And so this is intentional. So here's so in a way, to me, taking the personal and seeing in context of a system is part of the healing. Right? I know that for myself, so much of my personal experience of racism, such as being called, like a chink when I was in North Dakota in the 80s, my first response was to go, who are you talking about? I'm not Chinese, right? And then realizing, of course, in the system of racism and specify to Asian American is that we all look alike and we all should go home, right? So because we don't belong here, supposedly, right? So seeing that in context as a system, paradoxically, seeing it as not personal, but part of a systemic, and so that that person saying that to me is also conditioned in their position, right? Or is that being that power up position, you're conditioning and that is safe to be contemptuous and othering of other people. So sometimes, so for me, part of that process, which is more in the second and third, is this reframe the personal into a structural, and that helps to start the healing. And so we start though with the personal, right? Because it impacts us and there's actual hurt and harm here that needs to be tended to. So as I said, I'm Vietnamese American. So my birth sister and I were adopted when she was 10 and I was 8. We moved from Saigon to Bangkok to live with the Shuts, Caucasians who worked in the State Department. They actually met and worked for 8 and 6 years in Vietnam. And then they had just moved to Bangkok, right, after they'd married. So we were adopted, and then a year and a half after, they moved to the DC area, right? And very much, as my adopted mother said it, to Americanize the girls, right? So we moved to Fairfax, Virginia, a suburb of DC. This is 1975. My mother, Betty, often took my sister and me to the grocery store. When we get to the checkout counter, inevitably, the checker would look at us, then look at my mother, and it would be a confused look on their face. And then they would do it several times. Then they would make eye contact with my mother, and she would say to them, "They're my daughters. They're adopted. They're Vietnamese." The last 2 statements always sounded like one sentence, like they're rolling. They're adopted, they're Vietnamese. Then the checker would say some version of, poor things, looking sadly at my sister and me. How awful, that's too bad. You're so kind to take them in. Now, if we take this into my 3 stages, first is seeing internalized assimilated truth, right? So remember the truth of my experience as part of a system or a process. That's another way to understand system. And in this case, of othering, right? This is the huge part about the impact of racism, right? Is that most of us, especially I would say in the United States, we have the sense that we're all equal, we're all one. And then when othering happens, there's that separation. And I had actually, do I want to tell this story? Because I'm already behind, I'm only on page 3. Actually, I'm going to tell because you guys are practitioners. It's a difficult one, both for me and probably for you to hear. So I was at a monastery and I was in my second and a half full year. And we were in a practice period, right? And it was really the second, at Tassajara, we have a sesshin every month in practice period, right? So aside from, of course, if you're a Tangario student. So in my second year, so of course I only have 3 sesshin. So I'm pretty sure we were in the second. I actually have the tape, so I could go look at the date at some point, I suppose. So the teacher, of course, a white man, was talking about the koan, right? Master Ma and a monk are walking in the garden, right? And the bush shakes and birds fly up. So Master Ma says, "Oh, where have they gone?" And now I say I didn't plan to tell this koan or the story. So, the master says, basically, what of those birds? That's not quite the line, but now I'm right. And the monk says, they have gone away. And so then Master Ma turns around and grabs the monk's nose and twists it so hard that the monk screamed, right? And in the scream, he became enlightened. Right? That's a basic story. Now, the teacher telling this story then said, okay, and now actually I should set the scene a little bit more. So if you've been at Tassajara, in this case, so you come in the front door, right? And the teaching seat is either on the left or on the right. So, and then of course, because it's a Soto Zendo, the middle seats are the honor seats. So in the middle, so I was sitting over here, right on the side wall. Now, again, I'm pretty sure my 4th practice period, and I've been there 2 full years, maybe 2.5. So I felt part of the community, right? And don't forget, I'm a perfectionist or recovering perfectionist and a form queen. So, I was such a fantastic Zen student, right? And I felt like I got along with everybody and we were all together in one part of the community. So then the teacher says, now remember, most of these koans come from China. And so don't forget that their noses are not the same as our Roman noses. So probably the teacher needed to take a handkerchief so that he could get a better grip on the nose. The whole assembly, the whole Zendo burst into laughter. And 2.5 years of practice in the middle of sesshin. So I'm settled. I'm really settled. And I remember my experience as this so clearly. All of a sudden, the Zendo had a sense of elongating, right? Going away from me, right? Like all in silence, right? Just the Zendo elongating, and I'm at this end. And consciousness said, or I heard, my consciousness heard, other, other. And telling the story these days, I actually feel like my chest is heavy, my throat and scratchy. And part of me wants to cry. But I remember in that moment, it was so clear that this was an experience of othering, that I felt separate from this group when I had felt a part of it. And so it was so clearly the sense that this was an experience in which it was othering. Of course, in the practice period, at that time, I was only 2 Asian Americans. Might have had 1 Black person and 1 person who wasn't sure yet if they were Asian American, right? So of course, in that Zendo, and I was the only person anywhere close to Chinese descent, because Vietnamese in China, right? So this really sense of othering is it's a actual, this is the injury, right? That sense of togetherness is part of our, I would say, most of our experience. And then when these experiences happen, this othering, it's an othering of others, right? So, all right, now I'm gonna really have to hurry. So back to, sorry, I didn't really mean to say that. So now I have to take you back to my story of the checkout counter, right? So for me, the harm, of course, and this is back when I was 8, so I didn't even have this other experience yet in the Zendo, right? Was a sense of otherness, right? A feeling different from my mother, right? Who I thought was my mother. And by the way, just to give you a context, since we're in the State Department, we had diplomatic passports. And I spent all my time at the American Embassy or in American culture. And I came from a country in Vietnam. When I was in Vietnam, I was part of not othering, right? So then I was adopted and I'm young, I'm 8. And my parents kept calling me American. I had an American diplomatic passport, which in those days, you know, when we travel, which we did a lot, we went through a different line. We were treated better, right? Went through a different line. Cars, you know, people hold our names up and whisk us off into cars to drive us places. My father was, while not an ambassador, was the same level in the State Department. So, you know, I thought I was American. So it wasn't until I came to the continental, or the America itself, the land of America, that I was questioned of my Americanness, right? So, and that started by this nonverbal thing. Right? So this first step is actually, to me, first and second noble truth, right? First, to really acknowledge that racism is, and otherism really, is a system of a process of othering. And that's the hurt and the harm. And then how is this conditioned? Right? How is this structured and defined, taught, enforced, perpetuated? Right? How has white supremacy affected me? And on all sides, not just personally, but it has to be in context, which is where the process is. And by the way, I think practice is a lot like this, right? This is what I tell people, that the difference, because, you know, everybody wants to come and meditate now. The difference between practice and therapy is that, I'm simplifying, of course, but a lot of practice is about, for us to see the processes of things, right? And how we can interrupt processes, whereas it's not just about what is my feelings, what is the impact, right? And then how can I tend to the impact? Not that it isn't part of our practice, but ultimately a large part of the more healing part of our practice, I think, is to give us a space to see that it's a process as opposed to identity. You know, I just came up with that. I like that in terms of the, you know, sounds. Here we go. Right? So really, what are the causes and conditions that brought this into being? That's the second noble truth here. And then, and then the story that I'm different from my adoptive mother, and this is pitiful, right? Due to being Vietnamese, because I'm identified there as Vietnamese. And the otherness is that also no one ever addressed my sister and me. We were just objects to be talked about. And so how does family and culture, that's part of the condition. How does our family and our culture teach us these things, create the condition? And that's, in this case, it's okay to be an object to be talked about. That I, in fact, should stay quiet and receive it, right? Since I'm pitiful and there's something sad about me. And by the way, my mother, Betty, who was one side, she was first generation German, the other side, she was second or third generation German. Betty reinforced this by we were really taught that children were to be seen and not heard, especially at the dinner table, right? And we were only to speak when we were spoken to. That was like a strict rule, right? And that I know came from her German heritage, right? Because I've heard about my grandma, who when she lived with us had dementia, and I thought was one of the sweetest person on earth. And then when I heard stories later, I was like, oh, wow, grandma, right? And also then the condition of for my mother, Betty, of being raised in the 40s and 50s, right? Of white American. Of course, it's also reinforced by, since I was 8, already developed in many ways in Vietnamese culture, which also has this thing that children, are filial to their parents. So you wouldn't dare question them, right? So, and also saving face is really big. So to never question an adult in public. And so what were the systemic or structural conditioning, right, which reinforce, promoted, perpetuate these beliefs and feelings and views? Of course, the colonial mentality of ownership and patronization. Vietnamese were servants or support staff at the American embassy. I personally never saw. Well, I did have some interaction at in the embassy as a child, but from all the pictures my birth mother has put together for us, Vietnamese people were always the support staff, right? That's my experience. So then the second in this is seeing how our reactive truth, right? I think it's often due in part to what we think as ways to respond after recognizing the impact or the injury of the structural racism or racial conditioning. And of course, I'm putting it linear and I'm making a certain clarification as a way to examine. So it doesn't mean that this is true of everyone or that it's tight as truth. And it seems in my experience that part of the reactive truth is still a white-centered truth. It's a little bit like, all my parents are dead now, by the way. And after my last parent died, which was, 2000, so 20 years ago, I was in therapy, right? And union therapy, somewhat. And so, this whole sense of myself as an orphan, like I had 2 sets of parents and I'm an orphan at 30, right? 32 or whatever it was. And so it was like, what is that? And one of the things I came up was, now I'm responsible for my life because I'm not acting against my parents or for my parents. I feel like when you have a parent or when a parent's alive, that's my experience, I'm always like either, as my parent want that for me, I won't do that. Or, I'm trying some way to get their approval, right? That, like I was always living in relation to them, even though they might not be in the room anymore, even in the same distance when I purposely moved as far away from them as I could, right? But I'm still in relation to them, right? So this is, you could say, and this is still in relation to whiteness. So sometimes that's internalized racism. I'm not sure at this point I could say that that's tightly so. But really, how have I reacted to being seen? Right? And so in the third noble truth, this is where do I have agency? Where do I have some sense of power in this, of self-empowerment? right? And so for this step, I would say perhaps the agency is undeveloped, right? Because here's an example. So, gosh, I'm in my 30s again. And I realized, because I had this huge crush on a blonde girl who was a barista at a coffee cart. And it was in Seattle. I would walk to go to school at the community college, always on the other side of the street, because I was too, like flustered to ever be on the same side of the street as I passed the cart. But I was always look sideways, right? Right? Pretend I don't look, but of course my whole attention was over there. And I'd never been attracted to a blonde before too, right? So that was also like, oh, what is this, right? And this is not my type, for one thing, right? So in part of that whole process, and having some Asian American friends at the time and talking, it really came to me that, wow, I grew up, as I said, in North Dakota. I went there my formative years. I was 15, I think, when I first went to North Dakota. And so my sense, and my first love was a girl from the Midwest who was white. And so I was really conditioned to find white women attractive. I really felt that and thought that. And so I purposefully did not date white girls. I only dated women of color, right? And that was a very purposive move. And it was very much training myself to see, in particular, Asian women and women of color as attractive, to really decolonize my mind, because I de-whiteness my mind and my sense of what is attractive, right? And so, so that to me is one version of that. It doesn't have to be necessarily reactive as yet, but it's reactive in the sense that it's still with that reference. So unlearning or relearning takes time, right? It takes a lot of trials and active participation, right? And in particular, participation with intention. And of course, doing it also with others helps, right? Because part of, I think, the harm of any oppression is that it makes us feel isolated. It makes it feel like this is about you, as opposed to this is something that whole groups of people are impacted by. And so, for example, right, when I moved here to the Bay Area in '95, I was very involved in, since I mostly hung out with Asian American, lesbians in particular, or queer Asians. I was part of a group here that, I can't remember now the acronym we had because we were merging, but basically something like Asian, lesbian, bisexual, whatever, right, group. But actually we were the first, I was on the board, and we were the first ones, and we purposely did it, to be in the Chinese New Year parade, right? We were the first, we organized that. And it was the year of the rat, because we are very conscientious. So for a lot of Asian Americans and Asians, coming out to your family is really, really difficult. It's seen in, I don't know about these days, but probably still, that's a Western disease you get, right? And so, because it's televised, right? It's a huge event. Our mass, we had different variations of mass, so that people could, if they ended up on TV by accident, wouldn't be outed by the public to their family by being on TV to their family, right? So, actively doing things with others supports both my learning and to overcome this kind of individualism that is part of the system and the processes. So then the third is clarifying as it is truth. Responding by taking into account what we know as structural racism, our reactive patterns, and then responding with informed agency, clarifying agency, maybe you could say transformational agency. I only pause on that because I don't want it to feel like, it's going to make everything okay. And again, so much to me, practice is like this. We come to practice to meet our experience again, right? In this moment, whatever you think about the past is your moment about the past. And so part of the gift of this is, how do we reinterpret it? How can we reframe it to make sense to us now, and on a certain level to be healing now, right? To make sense now in the context of our life in this moment and where we want it to go. So taking myself and the situation I experienced into account, being inclusive of me and the condition and place at the time, and of the people, like my mother, understanding more Betty's experience. And then reinterpreting how the injury then is or isn't or can or doesn't have to be painful here and now. How do we not re-traumatize ourselves on a certain level, or re-traumatize others as we experience it now? So another way you could say that is, what do I know to be true here and now? Not from a place of invalidation, right? Not questioning. Either inside, is that really my experience? Or was, somehow the system wasn't accountable then. But really from a place of restoration and healing. Sometimes I call that reclaiming wholeness. So it's not a static or fixed sense of ourselves, but one within context, then and now, right? So history is really important, and a sense of intentionality, presence, right? That will engender an aspirational future. Right? How do I interpret now and frame it now that supports me to have a sense of hope and a sense of the shift that can happen here? So, and it's true, I call it the third aspect, but I don't know if it's so linear. Right? Includes the third noble truth here as much more informed, as clarifying, as active and ongoing. And the fourth noble truth, how do the aspects of the practice, or the practice in this case, support me to know I have agency or I'm empowered in this situation? So what supports this? Here's some things I found useful and supportive. Deep listening. First, it seems to myself. Sometimes I call Zazen deep listening, because you're the only person there and you just hear yourself. Of course, at first you think it's everyone else's fault, that, with the noise they make and all. But as we all know, as having practiced any time, mostly it's this heart and this mind that seems to be driving things. So deep listening. And actually, I think this is the gift of Zen practice in particular. That's a body. We always hear Zen as a body practice because we start to really know ourselves much more. My posture has really improved, right? Not for many reasons. And a lot of it is this really paying attention to it and the impact of how heart and mind has on it. We're not just strict about the upright posture because it actually is a healing posture. It's a posture that helps us to be open and receptive, to be inclusive of our experience, right? And the experience, by that, I mean my experience internally and externally, and the relation between those two. So in a way, it also can be, and this is much more to put it into this context. Maybe not totally true, but anyway, can it be a way to be with traumatic impact, to be able to release tension from the past as we re-experience it now, or as we reflect on it now? Then there's also what I call hear speech, H-E-R-E. Right? Hear speech is, I have this practice with my students and myself, in which if I say things like, oh, I think, la la la, when it's not really a thought, or I say, well, I feel like it's, when it's not about an emotion, or you know, or it's just like this, to minimize, right? Or to not help me really connect to practice. So I often interrupt my students and say, can you say that without, I feel like, or it's like this. So, and in my other class, I have some people who haven't practiced that much and certainly haven't had to practice discussion. So one came to practice discussion and was like, can you say more about this? Because I find it difficult, right? And so I said, well, to me, it's a little bit like we have posture adjustment. I'm here to do speech adjustment. I'm here to really, my intention behind this is to support you to be really with your experience. Because I know in my experience, when things are difficult, besides, looking off when I'm really talking to you, but I look over there and not make eye contact, I often say, it's like this, or I feel like when really I am sad, or it is painful, or it's right. So I just did it. Perhaps also looking for examples or mirroring. Not perhaps, I would say that's important. Right? It's really aspirational examples and relational. Kalyana Mitras, your teachers often are aspirational. And of course, in our different Buddhist traditions, especially in the West, a teacher can be your Kalyana Mitra, could be your master, could be your guru. And then revolutionary or transformative through understanding human nature and being with not knowing, perhaps even making space for it. Kathy Park Hong, in that book, I want to read this one section. Again, she's a writer, right? When we are inspired by a poem, she's talking about how sometimes in appropriation, a lot of people of color culture has been stolen and made into, earlier she talked an example about swing music, right? Very much started in the Black community and then became made into a big band swing. So this relating somewhat to that and about other cultural stuff. When we are inspired by poem or novel, our human impulse is to share it so that, as Lewis Hyde writes, it leaves a trail of interconnected relationship in its wake, end quote. But in the market economy, art is a commodity removed from circulation and kept. If the work of art circulates, it circulates for profit, which has been grossly reaped by white authorship. Speaking on this subject, Amiri Baraka offers an invaluable quote. All cultures learn from each other. The problem is that if the Beatles tell me that they learn everything they know from Blind Willie, I want to know why Blind Willie is not running an, I want to know why Blind Willie is still running an elevator in Jackson, Mississippi. End quote. We might make right this unequal distribution, but we must do so without forgetting the immeasurable value of culture exchange and what Hyde calls the gift economy. In reacting against the market economy, we have internalized market logic where culture is hoarded as if it's a product that will depreciate in value if shared with others. Where instead of decolonizing English, we are carving up English into hostile nation states. The soul of innovation thrives on cross-culture inspiration. If we are restricted to our lanes, culture will die. I forgot to set up that this chapter is called Bad English. And so it talks about how, of course, as Asians and other immigrants, but Asians and Latinxes, our speech, right, is considered bad English versus European accents are considered educated or romantic. Right? She continues, and this is the part I really want to share. She says, rather than speaking about a culture outside your experience, the filmmaker Chinti Minha, Vietnamese, suggests we speak nearby. In an interview for Art Forum, Trin says, when you decide to speak nearby, rather than speak about, the first thing you need to do is to acknowledge the possible gap between you and those who populate your film. Chinti Minha is a filmmaker. In other words, to leave the space of representation open so that although you're very close to your subject, you're also committed to not speaking on their behalf, in their place or on top of them. You can only speak nearby, in proximity, whether the other is physically present or absent, which requires that you deliberately suspend meaning, preventing it from merely closing and hence leaving a gap in the formation process. This allows the other person to come in and fill that space as they wish. Such an approach gives freedom to both sides, and this may account for it being taken up by filmmakers who recognize in it a strong ethical stance. By not trying to assume a position of authority in relation to the other, you are actually freeing yourselves from the endless criteria generated with such an all-knowing claim and its hierarchies and knowledge. This reminds me of a line from the Genjo, or two lines from the Genjo koan. To carry yourself forward and experience mere things is delusion. That mere things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So, in these times, we really need to look and examine ourselves and the life that we're leading. I don't think we cannot. Of course, the life we're leading is individual and collective and in context. As I see it, can't be any other way, because our lives, our nation, and our earth depends on it. Thank you for your attention. And I realize I was much longer than I intended, and so I don't know if there's time, and I'm open to interaction if people have any. Or stopping if we need to. If you're speaking, you're muted, so, or to me.
If you're up for it, Reverend Lien, if there's any quick questions or comments, and if there's nothing that's coming immediately, we can do the chant. So just unmute if you have anything, or otherwise we'll do the chant.
And if this helps support the start of it. Oh, is that a question? If no, you can also put in chat if you don't want to physically interact.
I just really appreciate you telling your stories. It made your talk really meaningful, because your personal experience in the supermarket and you know, in the lesbian group you're in, and so thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And what's your name? Because I don't think it's meeting secretary.
Tomas, that's from another meeting.
Nice to meet you. And I realized I was at the checkout counter last time I was at your Sangha, I think. So I shop a lot to you guys.
A lot happens at checkout counters. A lot of human interaction. Thank you so much, Lien. It's just so appreciate your voice and your And it's just also really exciting to see like the building of your philosophy and your theories. Like, it's like, and it's wonderful and yeah, so good to have your Dharma in our Sangha. And you're also, it's recorded on YouTube. So there will be more folks who see that than are live here today. Just another. Okay, so the ending chant is in the chat. If you can do it.
Oh, me? Who? Sorry, I can't see you and have the chat up. Are they frozen?
To free them, the visions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it.